Well, good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you're joining us from around the world. Welcome back to Creation Conversations, where you join us for another discussion type week where we're trying out this new format of Creation Conversations where we sort of have a joint chat around a central theme. But there are still a couple of little things that we need to jump in and talk about. Now, we're kind of doing part two of what we dealt with last week, which is Craig's trip around Australia and some of the ministry that's been going on and some of the reports there. And if you remember from last week, we kind of left off where at the coal mines, right, and the coal starting to in those ginormous coal mines. So we're going to start back there a little bit later and dig in a little bit deeper into the fossils and the coal, and there's plenty more to be exploring as well. But to start with, we're actually going to go back to a program that was put out. Well, it was originally put out quite a number of months ago, actually. You see, when we put Creation Conversations out, what we do in our UK team is we will take Creation Conversations and trim them up, right? Every person's little segment will be chopped up, and then that's part of what provides content to you every single day as it goes out. And it's scheduled quite far in advance. But I just want to bring up one of our latest videos. It went out, I think, about a week ago or so, just over a week ago. You might be able to see it just up here on the screen. I just need to make sure. Yep, there it is. Lovely. And I'll just pull this up a little bit higher here for you. Now you can see this is a program that we did for Creation Conversations a number of months back, but this went out just a week or so ago, and it's about Jurassic Ark and the living fossil flood deposit that is found there. It's a segment that Diane did, and it actually got quite a nice number of views, a little bit more than normal. Just over 2,000 views on our YouTube channel, which is great. Anyway, the point being is that there was quite a lot of comments. Obviously, the YouTube algorithm swung in our favor, and we've ended up with quite a few more viewers and, as always, quite a few more comments. And a lot of the comments are from a sort of antagonistic point of view. You can see, evolution talking here about the bacteria and the evolution in bacteria and penicillin resistance, which is something which we've dealt with extensively, not only on Creation Conversations, but also on our AskJohnMackay.com website. But there seems to be a recurring theme amongst the skeptics, which is this question of evolution and whether or not change means evolution or whether or not evolution means change. You can see here this particular comment here, Diane, look, you seem to completely misunderstand modern evolution theory. Evolution does not require change. It attempts to explain how change may slowly happen in response to changing environmental pressures or other factors. And again, here, look, this one, evolution doesn't demand change. Now, you can obviously go and have a look at this video. It's well worth watching it. It's a good little program that Diane did on Creation Conversations a little while back. But you see, what we are going to eventually do in a week or so's time is deal completely with a program answering this question: does evolution require change? Does evolution mean change? And I mean, I'll give you a little bit of a spoiler here, right? You see, Charles Darwin, in his book on the origin of species, he said, my theory is dependent on not necessarily the strongest creature surviving, but the one that's most adaptable to change. So you see, Darwin, the certainly popularizer, many people would view as the founder of evolution, he certainly seemed to think it had something to do with change. But perhaps we'll have a comment briefly from John and Diane, because this is a little sort of preview, a little sneak peek, because we're going to come back and really extensively deal with this question. And obviously, it doesn't just come into what is evolution. It doesn't just deal stuff like antibiotic resistance in bacteria. It also goes into things like living fossils and what really is the point. Does evolution actually require change? So, John, Diane, any quick comments before we move on?
Being gender biased, Diane, ladies go first.
Thank you.
Well,
yes, indeed.
Diane.
Charles Darwin was presenting a theory of change about how creatures that were different changed into ones different from now, changed into the ones that we have now. If you look at the standard theory of evolution of the history of life. According to that, we all started out as single cells, which had to change into something else in order to get to all the amazing variety of life that we have now. In fact, you regularly come across articles about, our last common ancestor, which was something quite different to what we see on the earth today. So certainly in everyone's mind, and in Charles Darwin's mind, evolution did mean change. And if you don't have change, you don't have evolution. And that was the very point we were making with that program, that the evidence shows living fossils, things that don't change. Now, Darwin admitted that these things exist, but he called them anomalies because they didn't fit with his theory. So if anyone else has something to add about
Yes.
that, but yes, we will. We'll go into that a little bit more and into the whole issue of living fossils and the evidence from both living things and fossil things.
I'm reminded of the politics of change here, not to want to change away from the subject, but to change to a similar analogy from the Aboriginals in Australia. I was working in Mount Isa, Cloncurry region, and there was a place up there, Century Hill, Century Town, call it whatever you like, but Century was the common theme there. And when I was first there, it was just regarded as a block of black rock that was worth nothing. And the Aboriginals did not claim it as sacred or anything. And then the mining companies found, hey ho, there's a big pile of ore here. All of a sudden, it was sacred land that had always been regarded as so by the Aboriginals. And of course, they reaped the good financial profit out of that. In other words, the designation of something is often related to the aims or the goals of the people making the claim. Now, in the case of evolution, the comments we're seeing about evolution doesn't remain change would have got you failed in a high school test, in a university test, because what you're really saying is that evolution and producing after their own kind are not all that different. But in reality, evolution is radically different, so that if you say evolution doesn't demand change, are you saying evolution hasn't caused change? Because if you do, you really should own up to being a creationist who believes things after their own kind. But what's happening is this. You see, we have been so successful, and you can watch many of my debates around the countryside and other creationists debating as well. Often the easiest tactic is to go through the fossil record and show the comments that I've made so often from Professor Carter from Cambridge. Once an organism appears, it seems to remain inherently stable. Now, he thought of that long before Stephen Gould came up with his static view of evolutionary ideas. But you see, in reality, you can go to the fossils, and that's one area I've done all over the planet, from Alaska down to the southern islands off the coast of Australia, from east to west. You can find a fossil, call it as old as you like, accept the age of it, and if it's a stromatolite, it remains a stromatolite if it survived to the present. Yes, it may get bigger, smaller, fatter, thinner, any subspeciation form you like, but in reality, it remains the basic kind. So what we're looking at is the fact that creationists are so successful in claiming that non-change is the trademark of the fossil record. Darwin said so himself, we confirm that, the fossils show it, and you are talking through your nose. If you say evolution doesn't demand change, you are trying to find a loophole when there are none. So we will come back to that in a full program, because you need to clarify that going from molecules up to men does actually involve a little bit of change, and you need to admit it. Trying to find picky holes by saying, oh no, you don't, you can stay a flatfish if you like, or if you can't change. Sorry, we'll come back and beat you on the head with that nicely, of course, in a few programs' time. Back to the team.
Oh, that's great stuff.
One of the commenters was saying that it doesn't have to involve change. It's only change in response to environmental changes. Is that right? I think that was one of the comments.
That was one of the comments. Yes,
So in say 1 million years, how much environmental change is there going to be? a lot, and yet they're saying creatures haven't changed for 200 million years. I mean, the amount of environmental change in that period of time under their understanding is incredible. Even the dinosaur extinction was because of a major environmental change, and yet things like the nautilus and crocodiles and things haven't changed for even longer periods than that. So they're saying they're unchanged through all these environmental changes anyway.
Yeah, especially when you realise that you can trace back a huge number of living fossils after their kind all the way back to the Cambrian explosion, right? So some 500 million years, supposedly, earliest kinds of life. In fact, stromatolites go back even further than that, supposedly, to the billions of years. And really what you're saying is, well, in 500 million years worth of environmental change, there's been no evolution. Right now, what that tells you, and the only thing you can see is, or in terms of change, is effectively extinction. So creatures die out, and so what it tells you is that these creatures have been reproducing after their own kind, and they're designed to do that because environmental change will either kill them off, force them to adapt within their kind, or they will continue reproducing after their kind with no change whatsoever. And that's exactly what we observe in the fossil record.
It tells you they're zealots to their own religion as well.
Exactly.
Nothing will convince them otherwise.
No, that's good. Okay, so we'll get around to Craig's report in a bit, but we've had another question that's cropped up, and it's one that was sort of aimed at John, but it's been dealt with by Diane as well, and it's to do with our Ask site. I'll just pull the question up now that we had sent in. Now, this was sent in to you personally, John. Yes.
Yes. Well, it was sent to the Q&A section.
It's quite a long question, so it's covering some of us up, but let's just read down through it. John Mackay writes that animals from Australia had maybe 100 years to go to Noah. Yet he doesn't answer how they would get back, nor does he address how they would, in the process, find food that they were adapted to. A penguin, for example, cannot and could not survive in hot climates. The same would go for animals adapted to hot climates, passing through areas with cold climates. So, John, you've had the question asked. Over to you.
Yes, and those of you who get our electronic newsletter this Wednesday, you'll get the full answer to that in the actual mail out link to our Q&A site, etc. I'll just remind people of a couple of things. They can look up this question themselves and discover one thing. We talked about Australian animals, not animals from Australia. You might think there's not much difference there, but in reality there was no Australia before Noah's flood, and the question makes that very clear. So they didn't come back to Australia because they never left there. Australia and America and all the subcontinents don't exist till after the flood, right? So that's point number one. Point number two, in terms of climate distribution, etc., before the flood, the world was still pretty good. No summer, no winter. So all the selection pressures you're talking about that you're used to, and assuming that the polar bears and the penguins, etc., had to survive in the present and therefore had to be like that in the past, sorry, you need to get biblical glasses on, and that's what the question actually says. But full details on that Wednesday, and Diane and I will just thrash out one issue here, and that's the penguins. Now, I've traveled pretty widely around the world, and the one thing I've noticed is there are penguins on the equator in the Galapagos Islands. Now, Diane, you've made a few interesting comments in our coming answer. What do you notice about the penguins in the Galapagos? It is on the equator, so it's not cold at all, no ice, no snow. But how do they adapt to nesting?
Well, the Galapagos Islands are volcanic islands, so the vegetation is pretty sparse and there's very little soil there. It's just most of it's a rocky outcrop. So in order to protect their eggs, they just go and find caves and crevices and lay their eggs in those. And because it is hot, it's tropical, they have to protect them from the sun. Now, that's the extreme opposite of the Antarctic penguins, where they lay their eggs basically on their own feet. And they keep them on their feet and they cover them with a fold of skin and feathers, and that keeps them warm. But the basic penguin structure in terms of the anatomy of the bird is the same. The Galapagos penguins are small. The Antarctic ones tend to be larger. And in between the equator and Antarctica, there are a whole lot of other coastlines where you get penguins of varying sizes. They live on the coastlines of Australia. You can come and see them here. They live on the coastlines of South America and of South Africa. And they vary in size and nesting habits depending on what the terrain is like. So in Australia, where there is soil and sand and things like that for them to dig in, they will actually dig burrows and line them like a nest and protect their eggs from predators and from various other hazards, whereas the Antarctic penguins, basically, they just have to protect their eggs from the cold. So they do by keeping them wrapped around their own body, as it were. So penguins can live in lots of different places, and they do in this world. The interesting thing is they're only found in the southern hemisphere. The Galapagos Islands are right on the equator, so I think they go about 1 degree north or something like that. But basically, penguins live in the southern hemisphere. Polar bears live in the northern hemisphere. So there's been a great divide there. But there's a good reason for that, which we will explain in our answer to the question. Back to you, back to us.
Given my experience, Joe, you can swap to my screen at the moment. Diane mentioned the Australian penguins, and yes, we've seen them in Queensland. We've seen them in New South Wales, South Coast. I've come across them in Port Phillip Bay. There's a penguin colony down there. And what's interesting, in the days before access to many of these places were forbidden, I used to enjoy climbing cliffs, sea cliffs. Now, the one thing you note about these penguins is because they're so well designed for living in the water, even though they have to breed on land, they're never far from a coastline. And if you climb coastal cliffs, then don't be surprised, like myself, if all of a sudden out of an unseen burrow comes a honking, gawking, squawking, whatever word you want to use for it, small penguin, just letting you have it. And I nearly fell off the cliff one day when this penguin suddenly appeared out of nowhere. They certainly do inhabit cliffs above the water, and they certainly do dig burrows in Australia to keep them out of the sun. And they actually line their nests with feathers and soft stuff. In the Galapagos, holes in the ground out of the sun. In Australia, long burrows out of the sun, but more feathery because they're on the coastal regions. And in Antarctica, you see the whole range. And of course, the one thing that most people never notice is a penguin is black on the back and white on the front, like looking like little waiters with bow ties. And no one suggests they evolved blackness to keep themselves, in the sun because of the radiation, and whiteness on the front because they were hiding in the snow. It doesn't make any sense. Their coloration has nothing to do with where they live climate-wise at all. But more of that, as Joe said, coming up. If you don't get our electronic newsletter, I guess, Joe, you can tell them how to do that. And that will be coming up this Wednesday in full from myself and from Diane. Craig, one thing I've never found, I guess you have penguins in Tasmania, do you?
Yeah, we've got them right in the river right here where we live.
Right, up the river, hey?
Yeah, just here, yeah. Well, in the estuary that we're in, yeah, they're definitely right here. And it gets to over 20 degrees here, so they definitely don't need cold. The water temperature I'm talking about, the water temperature gets to 20 degrees.
People can visit your museum and go penguin watching at the same time, hey?
Well, they literally can if they go to the penguin display across the river, yeah.
And you'll also find, having come out of a zookeeping background, animals are remarkably resilient, particularly birds and mammals, warm-blooded animals, right, of being able to survive in a whole variety of environments and temperatures that they're not actually found in natively, shall we say. So, for instance, if you go onto Google and Google Saudi Arabia zoo penguins, I'm pretty sure there'll be some penguins in a Saudi Arabian zoo, or so on and so forth in the hot areas. So they can survive for pretty well, actually, in a variety of different environment types as well. There up on the screen, you can see the newsletter sign up, so you can use that to be able to go and sign up to the newsletter, and you can get the evidence news as well as the creation news that Creation Research produces. And there's links on there as well to get all the other newsletters from all different creation research officers around the world. All right. Craig, let's come over to you now. We've had one or two questions come in. We'll get onto the questions a little bit later, but let's come on to you now and pick up a bit where we left off last week with the coal mine and stuff and going. But I think you've also got a new project that you've been working on that you want to share with us as well. So it's over to you. We're going to carry on with part 2 from last week of Craig's report and discuss amongst us as we go.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. One of the things that I was quite excited to find just before I left on the trip, well, about 2 months before I was getting to this particular country town in the Hunter Valley, was a fossil preparation lab that a guy was selling. And I thought, oh, well, I got in contact with him and I said, if you haven't sold it by the time I'm up there, then, I'd be very interested in it. Well, as it turns out, he hadn't sold it. So I was able to get a hold of it, and I've got a couple of slides of it just so we can show Joe. That's it there, you can put your arms in the holes there, look down through the screen, and as you're chipping the rocks off with the tools, it doesn't cling into your face and body and so on. It's got its own built-in filter system, so it's got a sandblaster and it built in with it as well, so that that sucks up all the dust particles, and that's sort of a look at it there. It came with a Chicago air scribe and a little sandblaster there, so a microscope and a whole bunch of paleological glues and gear. So that's great. And if you come back to us, Joe, I've just got this first fossil that I found here. That's how I found it. I cracked it open and thought, oh, that looks good. I might use my new fossil lab to knock the rest of that back. And that's what I've got, a beautiful Glossopteris leaf from the Newcastle area, and hoping that we'll be able to get a lot more really cool fossils uncovered with that machine. There's another one that I've done that's really three-dimensional. That won't come out very well on the camera on the show, so I won't show it. But it's a real three-dimensional pile of brachipod fossils that looks really great.
Craig, can I just throw in one thing before we go any further, since you're telling us what you're doing for the museum? Since last week, I've gained a gift to our museum. So if you can bring this up, Joe, if you wouldn't mind. Craig's machine is on this thing now. If you take the slides down.
I'm just pulling that down. There we go. Okay. And there you are.
Okay, so here we have an interesting object. I'll try and get it to seeing distance. That's right. Last week I was doing a section on Aboriginals and Australia, the fact that they haven't been here for 65,000 years or whatever. We do have our open day at the new museum at Acacia Ridge near Brisbane coming up at the end of September, and this will be in a big new display case on recent acquisitions. You're saying, what is it? Well, because I was talking about Aboriginals, an old missionary, retired now, came to me and said, would I like a Sudanese boomerang? And he brought it along, and I had never heard of a Sudanese boomerang, although the Egyptians north, I paid £1,000 an hour to film what was in Tutankhamun's tomb. There's grave objects at the British Natural History Museum, the British History Museum rather, and Tutankhamun, the Egyptian, had boomerangs, but I didn't know the Sudanese did. And of course, what's interesting is two things. You can see when I hold it up straight, it's not exactly straight. See the blade at the end curves over that way? If you throw it straight, it pretty well will either hit with that end or this end. But if you actually throw it sideways, the scallop on the end actually begins to make it curve. So returning boomerangs, we think of them as exclusively Australian. It appears not. And of course, I got one comment from an avid boomerang collector, and he said, boy, I've been trying for many years to get one of those. They're so rare. And when I checked why Sudanese boomerangs are so rare, the answer is there's almost no trees to harvest in the Sudan, lots of grasslands. So we have been given a wonderful gift for our Australian Creation Museum, Discovery Centre rather, in Acacia Ridge. So have a look at our website. It should be up there this week on an application form. If you want to come to our open day, it's free, but the numbers are limited. You'll get to see boomerangs like that and a complete Aboriginal display free over at Success Street in Acacia Ridge near the Archerfield Airport. But our biggest room only holds 50 people at one time where we give lectures. So that's our maximum for the day, Saturday and Sunday, last weekend of September. See you there.
All right, great stuff. Okay, Craig, back to you. And I think we're picking it up in the coal mines now where we left off last week.
Yeah, I think so. There was a question I don't think really actually come back to us, Joe, before you go to that, because I've got this,
There you go.
piece of layered coal that I'd like your interpretation of. It's got these lighter mudstone bands either side of it. This comes from an area with lots and lots of coal in the Fingal Valley in Tasmania, and then you've got this coal layer between these bands. And I just wanted you and John perhaps to describe that process is a result of being laid down by water, isn't it? Rather than the long, slow processes of a peat swamp turning into coal. That's got all the hallmarks in my amateur's eyes of catastrophic water laydown.
Joe, you first.
And you'll also find quite often in these coal seams, you'll get big chunks of clay. Now, if you were watching 3 or 4 weeks ago, whenever it was, when we played for Creation Conversations, John's program on rapid coal formation, you'll remember that clay is a rather essential part if you want to make coal quickly. And in fact, we've not come across any mechanism that can make coal slowly, because your plant material will simply be destroyed and decayed and rot away before you have a chance to actually turn it into coal. So you certainly, not only do you need a rapid burial where you get things that are smushed up into the coal and you get big chunks of sometimes limestone and all sorts mixed up in it, but you also need that clay presence which you find in the coal, which tells you that not only must it have happened quickly, it did happen quickly, and you've got a demonstratively provable way of actually showing how this coal forms quickly based on some of the experiments that you can read about and watch about that Creation Research have done. So yes, definitely fast coal, definitely flowing water. There's no doubt about it.
Okay, I've got a specimen here which is not far from Jurassic Ark, which is part of our coal layers. You will see these darker layers. You'll see the lighter layers. Now, those of you who kept up with us may say, gee, that looks like it's been produced by your strata machine, which actually does make layers of dark and light, dark and light. And you may say also, I've seen that all around the place. Now, sometimes the darker layers are actually coal. And the evidence that the bottom bit is washed in and that the layers of coal are also washed in is overwhelming. You see, if you take all of this slowly and then have a sudden swamp washing in sand or clay, then it will rip the top of the coal up. It won't stay nice and flat unless you're doing what the strata machine does. Everything is coming in one side, all at the same time, and the water, and I have to repeat this over and over again because never once did I hear it at university, never once did I hear it at any geological conference, never once did I hear another lecturer mention that water is already in layers. Now, I've talked to pipe experts and sump experts and town sewage experts, and they say, well, we all know that the water travels in layers. That's why the outside gets deposits on it and the inside erodes faster, etc. Now, water naturally is in layers. I haven't found anyone who can tell me why, but what that does is automatically sort out plant layers and shale layers, clay layers, etc. And the other thing, Craig, that we might want to take up again sometime is the fact that you only get high quality clay where you have a small percentage of high quality coal, rather, where you have a small percentage of kaolin clay mixed in it. The coal is simply activated. The plants are degenerated. They are catalyzed by a small amount of clay. Too much clay, you end up with a clay band through the coal. Too little clay, and you don't get coalification at all. Too much water, and the result is it produces methane. So all sorts of reactions can occur here depending on what is flowing in with the coal. But the reason for the layers is just like in our strata machine, everything is flowing in sideways. So great find, Craig. And you'll find that those materials in the coal have been pretty well preserved, and yet they've all basically merged one to the other as the chemical process of carbonisation has occurred.
Right. Thanks, John. And just get the slides back up again then, John, and we'll start with that slide that we finished off with last I'll just go back up there. This is the massive coal bedding in the mines in the Hunter Valley. That little blue arrow at the top is the height of one of the 5 metre dump trucks there. This just speaks catastrophic laying, given all that John's just told us. So I nearly started off as a mine surveyor. My first job outside of high school that I was offered was to be a coal mine surveyor, but I turned it down and did forestry instead. Anyway, the area that we moved to was Gloucester. This is my hometown. I like to call it my hometown, where I met my wife, Rochelle. Absolutely beautiful country area in New South Wales. There is coal mines nearby. And the reason we do this research is at the meeting in Gloucester, there was a couple of coal miners that I knew quite well. And their question was about the age of the coal. And it's what they're fed, it's what they're told, and they had questions about this. They're Christian people, but they had questions about it, and we were able to talk about a little bit of the research we'd done. I was in this area as well that I was able to pick up this great petrified log. It really does look like a piece of firewood that you could put on your fire, but it wouldn't burn too well because it's solid rock, and it was very heavy. These sorts of fossils are what weighed our car down dramatically. I'm not sure exactly what I was bringing back with me, but at least half a ton of stuff, including the fossil lab and big fossils like this. But anyway, that's sitting in the museum now as an example from that area. While we're in the Gloucester area as well, there's Derek's back, but we're not looking at that. We're looking at the rock layers. And in this big cutting that we're in, there was these layers of boulders here. So I'd love to get John and Joe's perspective on this, and Diane, if she's got any ideas on it. But up close, this is what they looked like. There was lots and lots of rounded boulders, and a whole bunch of them had fallen down to the base. But when you get a wider shot of the cutting, you actually saw that these rounded boulders occurred in various layers as well. And then you had the silt and the mudstone and all the fossils in between them. So you've got some comments on that, guys? Is there any particular processes happening that would be of interest to our viewers?
This is a much more common phenomenon than most people think. You will notice again, boulders, non-boulders, boulders, non-boulders, boulders, non-boulders. And it's the same pattern we see again in the strata machine. And you say, how could that be? The boulders are so heavy, they sink to the bottom. Well, if you watch our strata machine program, and Joe will show a link a bit later, you will notice one thing, that we in our strata machine use two very distinctly different layers of material. One is the heavy mineral rutile zircon, really heavy, and the other is the lighter white sand. Well, the funny thing is the zircon actually doesn't go to the bottom first. The heaviest rocks end up on the top. And you can watch that program and learn why. So again, this fits the pattern of things being washed in, one layer containing heavier boulders and the other containing the lighter sand. And in all probability, it's the heavy bits which are coming in on the top. It's not forming like a glass where you throw rocks and sand and mud in, and the heavy rocks stick to the bottom and the lighter mud goes to the top. That's not the way currents work. And the only way you'd end up with layers of layers of layers is with currents coming from one direction and going to the other. Now, I'll make a comment on the layers that you saw in the Singleton mines. They are part of the Newcastle Basin, and basically there's a whole, I guess you could call it a mega system. The coal in the Sydney Basin area goes from Newcastle down to Wollongong, and then you form a triangle of coal beds heading north towards Queensland, leaning towards the northwest. And even the first professors who observed this said this has all been washed in. I'm talking about Professor Edgeworth David. The trees that Craig showed you are part of petrified trees, petrified because they've been washed in and buried rapidly. You don't get petrified trees in swamps. You don't get trees petrifying in swamps. They just get rotten. Even in rivers, the trees will rot if they're just washed in with a load of rocks. So again, you were looking at rapid layering with a strata machine type formation, not millions of years. Joe?
Yeah, and you remember, John, when we went to the Red Centre in Australia, and we went from sort of the Olgas and up to Ayers Rock and the like, you had, even on a greater, some of these boulders were like, almost a metre across. And these are just absolutely enormous boulders, all smoothed, so definitely carried by water. And then when you go to places like Jurassic Ark and you find that they're all of a sudden buried next to logs as well, you know that you're dealing with really fast water, because it has to not only transport the logs, it has to be fast enough to actually cause the rocks, the boulders, to be traveling along with the logs to be buried in. So you're definitely dealing with layer upon fast flowing current water. There's no doubt about it. So you've got this same kind of sequence that you find all over the world. You can come with me to the UK, go down to places like Budley Salterton. I took you there, John, many years back, where you get these huge cobbles next to little pebbles, next to fine grained sand, and they're all mixed in together, right? It's fast flowing water that's producing this.
Yeah, well, in fact, all of these layers here were full of fossils. And so I've got a few pictures of some of the fossils that we found there. So some Brachipods on the left there, in the middle, a really beautiful fine crinoid fossil that we found, but also some timber. So all of these things are also speaking of catastrophic processes, bringing the boulders in, bringing the plant, the sea creature, it's all mixed up in the various bits of the layers there. And there's one particular fossil that has timber and the brachiopods together. So I'd like to get that piece of timber, looks like it continues on there a bit. So I'd like to get my fossil prep lab onto that one. See if I can make it look even a bit better. Then we went a little bit further south, and that area in Mulbring, there's a well-known fossil site there. You've just got to get permission to get on there, which we did. And we didn't collect this one because it was embedded into the rock and would have fractured all up, but we left it there. And there was this beautiful bryozoan that exactly as we see here in Tassie. In fact, that photo I could basically tell anybody I found this one in Tasmania, and even experts would believe you, because it's exactly what you find in Tassie. And that's a beautiful example of it. And same with these brachiopods that we found there. Our regular viewers would know that on the various fossil trips that I've been on in Tasmania, that we uncover very, very similar fossils, if not exactly the same varieties there at Mulbring.
Craig, I'll just throw in a comment before you move on. Having studied brachiopods intensively, they still exist around Australia, in between the North Island and South Island, New Zealand, but they are incredibly reduced in numbers of groups of brachiopods that exist. There used to be hundreds of species. That's if the guys have classified them correctly, but many more varieties in the past than we have at the present. So again, the change is real, but it's the change that produced extinction. That's the only change, not evolution.
And extinction doesn't help evolution, does it?
No.
No, like I say, once if you're extinct, you're dead, and you couldn't evolve even if you wanted to.
Yeah. And the brachiopods that we've got are still brachiopods, aren't they? So time hasn't really changed them.
Yeah,
Okay.
lovely example of after their kind.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, a little bit further south in Caves Beach. This is on the southern end of the Newcastle region, and this is a polystrate tree. So we have shown this particular tree in a couple of shows in recent times, but there's a good perspective of it. And it's colified on the outside, interestingly, up close. I'm chasing my Toyota sponsorship with the keys there. Help pay for these things. It's going up through the layers. There was another one there as well on the right that wasn't as marked as the sort of colified one there, but that's its setting in the cliffs. So any additional comments? We've covered polystrate trees quite a bit in recent times.
Yes, again, you'll find that the ones that are dark are the ones where the outside is still preserved. The lighter ones have much less of the bark preserved. It's only the bark which becomes coal, not the inside of the tree. Right, the inside of the tree will often petrify. In those trees along that coast, which I've thoroughly investigated, you have a marvelous example of the chemical separation up the tree, starting with iron and ending up with carbon and silica and things like this as you go up the tree inside the trunk. But that's a different subject. But yes, they're vertical. And how many roots did you find on these trees, Craig?
There was none.
Good.
No roots.
That's what everybody observes if they're honest.
And the other really interesting thing was at the base of that cliff, down sort of on the ground where I was standing, there were actually more trees there. Actually, in the rock platform itself, and they were going down into the platform actually. So they were very levels.
You'll find if you can get into the caves, any visitors, there are many trees, vertical and horizontal, visible inside a cave. And it's just you can't see the horizontal ones many times in the cliffs because of the coloration. But on the beach platform, they're all over the place. And you can map the direction. And again, as Professor Edgeworth David noticed, this is a flood deposit. Trees without roots, vertical, trees lying down on the ground, covered up and squashed, trees with a directional current from somewhere up in the northwest.
And if you look really closely at the top of that photo, I'm not sure if my arrow you can see the arrow up in here.
Yeah,
that's coal as well. Up there. This is all evidence. I mean, I don't pretend to be an expert geologist, but when you look at it with the right set of glasses on, all of this stuff that we're looking at is catastrophically laid down. Indeed, this is just a little bit further along the cliff, and again you can see the big coal layers there up in here, and then you've got big sandstone cliffs coming in as well. A lot of it's tumbling down, so pray for our safety while we're out there, because we don't want one of these big rocks coming down while we're walking along there and looking for fossils. Any comments on that particular piece?
No, it's more of the same. Joe, do you got any comments? Because I've taken you to many of these areas along here when you came to Australia.
Yeah, and you find, this is also a global occurrence. I mean, obviously this is in Australia, which is actually where the first time that I came across polystrate trees, proper polystrate trees, because that's where you first took me to see them. But we can now take you to places all over the UK. John surveyed polystrate trees all over the UK. I found even more locations previously unknown to creation research. We can go over to the States, to Canada, and this is a global occurrence in what is essentially the same layer around the world. You'll find the majority of these polystrate trees are in the Carboniferous. That's the Pennsylvanian, Mississippi. And if you're in the States, some of these trees, like the ones in Australia, are in the what's known as Permo-Triassic, and we've spoken many times about boundaries and where geologists have confusion and disagreements over where boundaries lie. But you're effectively dealing with the same kind of preservation, the same kind of layer, the same kind of technique to produce these polystrate trees, and all of them require large amounts of water to rip them up, strip them of their branches, strip them of their roots, waterlog them to get some of them standing upright. And you see the same pattern everywhere you go. Layer of coal, they sit in the coal, there's no evidence of soil, they sit upright through the rock layers, and you end up with these polystrate trees. So we're definitely dealing with a catastrophic burial as well.
Joe, since you brought up, sorry, Craig. Joe, since you brought up Permo-Triassic, etc., I'll just remind people how these here on the East Coast became classified as Permian. They simply originally were regarded as like the ones in England because they had so many polystrate trees. They were coal, carboniferous type deposits as in England. But in reality, the argument ended up, well, we have the identical coal beds out near Lithgow with the same sort of fossil trees as you have in England. But by the time you get to the coast, you have this difference, that difference, this, etc. So it was reclassified, right? So that's the argument rather than any stratigraphical difference. These are not, if you like, they appear to you, Joe, just the same as the ones in England. And they did to the first geologists too. But like most places around the planet, we like to have our own layers, give them our own names. And the Americans perhaps top the list for doing that. But we won't the American bashers at the moment. So move on, Craig. This has been great. I've been here many times.
Yeah, well, the paleogeologist that we had come into the museum one day, he was a fossil expert, maybe not a geologist in the sense of coal and so on, but he was really shocked to see the whole polystrate tree evidence. And this evidence we've got here, this is a piece that had fallen out of the cliff, so we didn't go chipping away at the cliff or anything. This was on the rock platform. I actually went back to find a chisel that I'd left laying on the ground, which I do all the time. And it was raining. I didn't really want to go back out there, but as I was walking, I saw this and I thought, oh, thank you, Lord. This is a great piece that I'm able to carry, as heavy as it was, the few hundred meters back to the vehicle. And it's evidence of a couple of trees there going through many strata, that those strata have been laid down all at the same time the tree was there. Moving along, we then went to Terrigal, and there's Derek and I. We had quite a number of nice fossils stacked up on one of those rocks behind us, and then we had a freak wave come in. It nearly washed Derek away. He's not a big man. I was actually filming it, but I was so concerned for myself that I didn't actually quite catch Derek being completely inundated. So the rest of the trip, he was, because we were traveling that day, we just popped into this site. He was saturated from about his knees down. Yeah. Anyway, that's a bunch of, I think, dicroidium leaves there that we found at the base of that cliff as well. While we're in this area as well, the Lake Macquarie area of Newcastle, we did a combined school and homeschoolers day. And throughout the trip, we used this particular idea, which some of our regular viewers would be very familiar with, where I pulled out for the students this particular case, and I pulled it out of a little box and I shook it and said, this is my favourite toy. All I had to do was shake it and wait for a bit, and I'll put it back in the box and I'll pull it back out again and give it another shake. And so you just had to wait long enough, and voila, look what happens. And then I go and swap it over and pull this one out. And of course, everyone, I'm not trying to be a magician or anything, but people understand what's going on. But in this particular instance, a little voice piped up and said, "You swapped it." And I thought, what? And I looked at him, and he was a real little fella. And I said, how old are you? And he said, I'm 5 years old, and you swapped it. And so I said, well, you got me. And all the students laughed. And, of course, I pulled them both out. And I said, well, how did you know I swapped it? Because you made it. And that's the point. The only difference between those two sets, and they are exactly the same set. So before I went on the trip, I spent quite a bit of time making sure that I had exactly the same pieces in both of those sets, got the same sort of container. And the only difference between the two is that information has been applied to one of them. Outside information has been applied. And then the point is made that we're made up of building blocks. And the building blocks that make us up are much more complicated and much more fragile. And they're only put together to make a living being because outside intelligence has put them together. And that was probably our most well-received display, actually. They were all well received, but that one was in particularly powerful for people. So after the Newcastle area, as we were travelling south, we were actually travelling from Newcastle down the coast to Canberra. There you can see Canberra marked there, and Derek had to dry out on the way. And that's where we caught up with Diane. And we did a joint presentation. And Diane, maybe you'd like to tell everyone what we did.
Well, I did a program on the origin of the races, or the basically the sort of potted history of humanity from Adam through the flood, through Noah and his sons, to the Tower of Babel and the dispersion of different people groups after that, and how that fits into our big picture of the history of the world, good to bad to worse to salvation and glory. And it was very interesting. There was a man who had been a missionary to the Chinese for many years. He lived in Hong Kong and was a missionary to the Chinese, and he was very interested in that because we brought up the issue of the Chinese characters and the history that's written in that, and he understood that because he spoke Chinese fluently. And so he was very interested in the whole issue of the origin of the different people groups, and particularly of the Chinese. And of course, we have a whole display about that in our museum up in Brisbane for those who are able to come and see that in our open day. But it was a good example of how this is a very missionary orientated church, and to remind people that our basis for mission is that Christ is the creator of all people groups, and therefore he is their judge and savior of all people groups. And then Craig continued that on, gave some interesting history from the Table of Nations in the Bible, of where different people groups went to, and looked at some of the history there, and as well as giving his, he used the castle there as well. That was well received, and the whole issue of evidence for creation, evidence for biblical history, and it was well received. But particular highlight was this missionary to the Chinese. If you want to add anything to that, Craig.
Well, it was the only time on the entire trip, Diane, that I was nervous because you were there. I was right. Other than that, no, it was really great to do that together. Now, just a couple of testimonies on the trip there, just in that bunch of close triangles up in the Gloucester, Newcastle area. There was a number of people at some of the different presentations that weren't believers, and a young fellow called Matt in the Taree area, another young fellow called Evan, that we had some really good conversations with after the presentations, and I didn't, at the particular church service that I was speaking at in Taree, I didn't use the castle display, but I had it there, and then I pulled it out for one of these fellows and used it, and they were really taken with it, and had been been witness to by members of the church for quite some time, but it was a real great conversation that we had, and I think a real step forward in their faith journey. Okay, so I've got there the final encouragements, because Canberra, Wangaratta and Euroa, little country towns, Euroa is a smaller country town, Wangaratta is quite a large one, were very encouraging. We had good numbers of people turning up, and it was very positively received, and just a great way to finish the whole trip. So this is, I've got another picture later with all the towns on, but basically all the little black triangles are places that we spoke at, and numerous occasions on some of those. So that was basically the trip. Just a little bit more on our trip in Canberra. Diane also came out with us to the National Dinosaur Museum. There we are, a really great museum, but here's the Velociraptor, the way they present it. And this is actually quite ridiculous, and just reminding our viewers that a Velociraptor has never, ever been found with feathers, and yet this is wherever you go. We're getting quite a photo library of this now. The Velociraptors being depicted with feathers, not just a light feather here and there, but their entire body covered with feathers. This was the Melbourne Museum earlier, and in the trip. And again, it's a Velociraptor that they're actually an animation where they're showing the Velociraptor hunting like a chicken, chasing small ground lizards. There's Diane with a couple of other dinosaurs, the Oviraptor and Alxosaurus, which I hadn't heard of before. You got any comments on what you saw there, Diane?
Yes, they were very keen on the feathered dinosaur theory. They did have some good fossils there, and they did have some real dinosaur bones. But these models, they've gone with the current trendy thing and have put feathers and fibers and fur all over their dinosaurs. To be quite honest, I think they look rather silly. Where there have been real pieces of dinosaur skin found, they are clearly reptilian. So they are actually denying the evidence by presenting their models like this. But it's certainly more and more the trendy thing. And since the last time I visited the museum, they had a couple of feathered dinosaurs in an obscure corner, but now it's a whole big prominent display, and that's happening in other museums as well. So this is an idea that's becoming very, very popular. It's even got into kindergarten level textbooks or science books. One of my friends showed me a book that her grandchild, who was in kindergarten, was given, and it ended with the concept that dinosaurs have not gone extinct. They've just turned into birds, and they're now flying around in your backyard. So this museum is very much into that theory as well. And Craig, I remember you bought from the gift shop a little model of Velociraptor with feathers, just to reinforce the point that this is what's being presented to the general public now. And it's a complete fabrication. It's just imagination.
Yeah, that really hurts sometimes, spending that money on those things. But I think I've got 4 or 5 of them now, and it's probably cost me a couple of $100 in total. But what I find is at churches that people are, Christians in churches are quite shocked to hear this story, that this is something that's being presented everywhere. In fact, the real problem with it is this. There you've got a young child, family have taken them for a day out, and they're being shown this, they're being taught this. And in fact, at the homeschoolers / high school day that we had up in Newcastle, one of the kids piped up and said, I know that a chicken is a dinosaur. And he was very confident that a chicken is a dinosaur, and I had to give him the alternative view. Well, some of those other great fossils that had, and we took quite a lot of photos, but I've only got a few examples up here at the museum. Here's some stromatolite, which is presented as Australia's oldest fossil, and they're saying there that it's 3.5 billion years old, but are quite open that it's found in the Pilbara region of Western Australia, but right near an area where we've still got stromatolites today. So John, if you want that one, I've seen some of your other photos from other museums around the place. There's one that's actually giving it a 3.5 billion year date.
Well,
we've got really good specimens of all of those stromatolites, and if we ever get the money to put a stromatolite display on, it will go right from these oldest ones, supposedly, all the way up to the ones that live in Shark Bay, Western Australia, or in the lakes in America. There are deep freshwater stromatolites in some of the big lakes in Canada and the USA, fairly recent discoveries, and they have not evolved. They are still stromatolites. You could probably say once a stromatolite, always a stromatolite. That's what the evidence seems to be. Joe, you've got a comment on that on your lips, I can see it.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in and say that not only are they Australia's oldest fossil, if you take the geological time to be accurate, but they're now actually officially the world's oldest fossil. And the reason being is that the world's oldest fossil previously went to a stromatolite that was found in Bolivia in South America, and that was dated to 3.7 billion years old. Until they recently decided that it couldn't possibly be 3.7 billion years old and have reclassified it to just 70 million years old, right, into the Cretaceous. Now, that's a rather large jump in dates, right? This is the famous, if you Google stromatolite, it'll almost certainly be this type one that shows up, right? It's the famous almost sort of blackish gold kind of colored with all of the nice striations in it. Absolutely beautiful. We've got samples of them in our museum. I'm sure John has got samples in his. We got some for Glenn over in the USA. But from Bolivia, they've dropped from 3.7 billion to just 70 million. And it just shows you just how arbitrary the dates actually are. And as far as I can find, the only reason why they dropped the dates like that is because they found that in the same formation there was another fossil that must be far too complex for it to be that old. Therefore, it must be in the Cretaceous. So it really it just shows you these dates are just arbitrary, and there's no real evidence for them, no matter what. So hang on to your world's oldest fossil for as long as you can until the next theory comes up and drops it down.
And I have to apologise to little old me for not saying billion with the conviction of Carl Sagan there. So yeah, good one. Okay, well, let's keep moving. Here's Horodischia, which is a fossil that is actually found in Tasmania as well. This is in very old rocks as well, according to the evolutionary timescales. But see what it says there at the bottom. It's too complex for its great age. It's a mystery. That's because things were made complex, right? Any knowledge of that one, team?
Well, Diane, you can comment a little bit further on what I'm about to say, that my observations of microscopic creatures is if you and I need a body that's sort of 2 meters high, 1 meter wide, and half a meter thick, and is regarded as complicated, then basically every function we've got fits inside a paramecium or an amoeba. So it's incredibly complicated, even at the simple cell stage. Any comments, Diane?
Yes, there's no such thing as a simple biological organism. And it's interesting these days, now that we can scan fossils and see their internal structure, there are more and more reports coming out about the incredible complex internal structure that they find in fossils, which were considered to be simple simply because we could only see the outside of them. Now that we can look at on the inside of them without actually destroying them, we're finding more and more complex things. So this little worm-like creature is a classic example of that. There's nothing simple about it at all. It's very complex, and so are even some of the small, tiny crustaceans and various other worm-like creatures that they're finding now, and are actually able to scan the internal structure of them. Incredibly complex. But then that's what you would expect, because that's how biological things function. They won't function if they're simple, if they've got nothing inside them.
Yeah. Well, one of the terms that I've really come to be using as a result of this trip and all the museums that I've visited is storytelling, and the storytelling that goes against the facts, really. There's a lot of facts that are presented at some of these places, and it's the separation of the two. So that is a fact. Looking at the fossil, that's the fact. You know, you can measure the length of the fossil, you can identify where it's come from and so on. But storytelling is something that is prevalent, and this is an example of it. Can you pick the storytelling for this trilobite? This 505 million year old fast moving carnivore is from Douglas Creek in Western Australia. What's the fact and what's the storytelling in that? And I think most of our viewers will pick it. It's telling everybody how fast it was, and no one's ever observed how fast they are. It may have been fast, but no one's actually ever observed it. It's telling what its diet was. I'm not sure whether Joe or John or Diane, you know any evidence of what they ate, but it's also saying the time frame that it lived in. This is all storytelling, people that weren't there and haven't observed this animal in its living state.
Craig, this is sadly a common theme which the ordinary person assumes the scientist is telling the truth of what they've discovered. Now, if you want to demonstrate this, I still remember a young man I appointed to be an assistant editor when I was doing the Creation magazine, and his background had been as a science sort of assistant for one of the big Australian newspapers, and he was asked to write a report on Richard Leakey's latest discovery. And this was a caveman, you know, it was this old, and it did this and it ate that and it cooked and all this sort of stuff. And he asked his senior, do you want me to report the facts? And the boss said, yeah, just the facts. And he finally handed in a 2-line article, Richard Leakey found a bone, because it wasn't X million years old. We don't know what it ate. We don't know where it lived. We just found a bone. That was the only fact there. The rest of it was storytelling.
Yeah, there is so much. And people have got to just understand that this is what you've got to do when you're going to these museums. You've got to really separate the storytelling out. Enjoy the fossils, but pick the difference.
With regards to the diet, you'll find that the same assumptions with larger animals are used. So if you have an animal with big sharp teeth, you automatically assume that it's a carnivore. And we've dealt with that many times. That's not actually necessarily the case. Now, with a trilobite being an arthropod, what you'll find is that a majority of these types of creatures, think about the modern day woodlouse and the like, right? They do tend to be more scavengers than hunters. Now, just because they have mouth parts that would be able to be used for hunting doesn't mean that that's what they actually used them for. And you have to bear in mind that in the beginning, everything was very good, and they wouldn't have been using them either for hunting, and they wouldn't have even been using them for scavenging dead creatures. They'd have been using them to eat plants. And so you find that, okay, by the time you get to Noah's flood, what's the one thing that Noah's flood going to produce? Awful lot of dead things, right? So you can certainly see them becoming scavengers, but we have very little evidence, from my knowledge, unless John has anything to add, of them being carnivores, other than the assumption they have mouth parts that could have bitten through other arthropods or other creatures, therefore they must have done.
Yeah, that's about it, Joe.
I was really pleased with my oldest daughter's question when we were at the museum up in Winton, the Dinosaur Museum, after the guide had given us a long presentation about the carnivorous theropod that they'd found in the area, and actually the holotype of that dinosaur that they had at that museum. And right at the end of the presentation, my daughter asked him, well, how do you know that it was a carnivore? And he sort of paused and looked at her and thought, well, because it had sharp teeth and sharp claws. And so that just prompted my follow-up question. Well, is there any other evidence, like in its coprolites or in the inside its guts, in the fossils or anything like that? And he said, oh no, nowhere in Australia has that been found. So it's completely the assumption on the teeth. And so maybe it's my training is wearing into my children, that they'll ask questions like that, because that was a simple question but a very profound one. How do you know? How do you know?
Yeah.
Now, this is just another picture of a fossil that points to catastrophic processes, as we've had a bit of a theme on in this particular presentation. This particular trilobite occurs in such numbers that it's enriched the rocks in which it occurs in phosphate. So to do that, that's an incredible amount of creatures, and it's mined in those areas. So I find that interesting. Now, this one, to be fair to the museum, is a lot closer than what we've seen in other areas about how coal formed. And as we've spoken of earlier in the presentation, it says there that when the seed ferns and other plants died, their remains built up in vast thicknesses, which were buried by sand and mud. Eventually, this compressed plant matter formed coal. So that's getting a little bit closer to what we would agree with, although sand and mud don't bury anything really. It's the water that's carrying the sand and mud that buries them. And this obviously fits into our ideas of the flood of Noah's time doing this.
And in fact, if you want to go one step further, John will probably be able to back me up on this, but I suspect that fossil there is not from Australia. They look a bit too much like the Pennsylvanian ones, the ferns, as in from Pennsylvania. But the way, if it is the Pennsylvanian ferns, the one thing that you do find in them are lots and lots of fossil thorns. John's collected fossil thorns from there. I've collected fossil thorns in some of the specimens that we've got in the UK museum collection. And so not only can you get a flood perspective, you also get a really important perspective on the history of good to bad to worse, as well as a theological perspective, because, of course, thorns are the result of man's sin. And so not only have you got this being a watery deposit, as they basically admit they're getting closer to this, fast deposit, but you've also got to have this all happen after Adam sinned, because thorns are the result of man's sin, and these are full of fossil thorns.
Yeah, I've been to some of the Pennsylvanian mines where that sort of formation is very, very common, and collected lots of them, including the thorns. And I think you're right, Joe, just superficially looking at it from this screen distance, it certainly looks like one of those. You know it's a fern because if you look at the PTERIS at the end of the name, that's definitely the Latin/Greek that goes with a fern designation. There was a question came up in the chat about how did trilobite get its name, and you find it was invented by the man who spent his time in the 1700s playing with these things. You had lots of finds of trilobites, including the Dudley bug, and that with these generic type names, we find them as we dig up shale mines, etc. But the word trilobite simply meant TRI 3 LOB, meaning lobe, as in your earlobe. ITE is a designation to a thing, right? So a thing that has 3 lobes. The guy who first found them did not know what they were. They finally decided in the end they are some sort of crustacean type creature, and run from that. And from that time to this, we've just simply got better and better fossils. So, Joe, you've probably got them. If you haven't, I'll have to get you some. And gold trilobites, where the total intestines and the outsides are all preserved. And the same is true for our Australian fossils. And it's certainly true. The mines in the north are so rich with trilobites. There's one place there I've been to called Beetle Creek. It's like walking on a carpet of trilobites. So that they've been existing by the billions and then suddenly become deady bones, fully preserved so that the phosphate actually is entombed and soaks into the rock.
And those gold ones, I think, if I remember correctly, they can have like fossil eggs still inside of them.
Yes,
Well,
yes.
so
They're from a deposit on the border of New York.
That's yeah. But anyway, yeah,
Okay.
it's amazing stuff. Oh, that's
Well, here's they did, as Diane mentioned, that they did have some magnificent fossils there, and this is a great plate. I think John would even be impressed with that one. That's some perch. They even had a sign there saying that this is basically perch. It's the same as the modern perch and a stingray in there together. So,
Because we've got better specimens than that, Craig, so we will boast them.
Yeah, that has to be mentioned, of course. So that's the summary of the trip. There, most of the towns that we visited, 10,500 kilometres, 46 presentations over the 56 days, basically 2 months. And we did the field research as well. And it was great speaking to all those school students. Thanks for everyone that supported and came along. I know a few watchers of this program turned up to a couple of the locations, and that was great. Just while I was on, just to round up, and then maybe we can go to some questions. I was taking photos of eucalypts throughout the trip on the whole journey, and the variation that you see within this created kind. I believe that the eucalypts are all part of the one created kind, although you see hundreds of different species of them. This particular one, the river red gum, is Australia's most widely distributed eucalypt, and it's found along the watercourses, including right in the inland areas, right in the desert areas. You'll find it. Then you've got the really stunted wattles and eucalypts. So the wattles are very hardy out there as well. That's what mulga is. If Australians have heard the term the mulga scrub, the mulga is wattle. And there's mallees like this that are all shooting off from the base. And so we've got some photos of those. And there's a bit of mulga actually behind those mallees there as well. And then when we got closer to the coastal areas up in the mountains of the Barrington Tops, we've got the high altitude eucalypt. So this is 1,500 metres, but it's actually in the cold air drainage area around a swamp. So that the cold air, it's called an inverted tree line. It's where the coldest tolerant trees are actually lower because the cold air drains into the swamp area, and they survive around the edges of the swamp in the cold better than some of the other species do. So that one's Eucalyptus stellulata. And actually above that is snow gum. So you go up a little bit away from the cold air drainage and you get into the better known snow gum, Eucalyptus pauciflora, which is a whiter barked tree. And then again, closer to the coast, you've got the tall wet eucalypt forests, and this is a yellow box from near where we were staying in the Maitland region. And of course, we've got the really huge eucalypts in Tasmania as well in the wet forest down here. So yeah, that's just some of the research that we're doing on the trip. Perhaps, unless someone else has got some other comments, Joe, we can come back and do some questions if any have come through on the chat.
Yeah, we have got a couple of questions to do, and just a reminder for everybody that we need to close down fairly sharpish. So we've only got about 10 minutes tops before we need to finish. Yes, thank you, Neil. It's nice when people point it out, so we don't have to point it out for them. We do need your support to be able to continue doing these not only programs but also trips and research and so on and so forth. Well, we have just a few questions. Thank yous first of all. We have a thank you from Neil, man of his word. There we go. And we appreciate all of your support and all your donations. The same from Douglas Woffey as well. So thank you very much. Going back to an interesting question here. It uses lots of symbolism. But we'll try and sort of make head or tail of it because I think it actually has quite an interesting point. Have penguins lost feathers, or have feathered birds evolved from penguins?
Well done, Joe.
I think the gist of the question.
Well, penguins are actually covered in feathers. I know when you see photos of them, they look smooth, but if you go up close to them, those are actually densely packed feathers. And penguin feathers are quite interesting. They are very well designed to be a swimming creature. Um, but no, penguins are a kind by themselves. They are well designed to be a swimming creature. They are densely covered with feathers, and that's part of that design for their life, for their lifestyle and for their habitat. Yes.
So basically, they are birds that live and
Mm.
breed on the land, but they swim very well. They have a total bird anatomy and a bird feathering system. They're real feathers. They're not imitation dinosaur feathers or anything like that. And again, they'll even pluck out their own feathers to keep their nests right, or use their feathers to warm their eggs coming up, or their baby chicks, which walk on their feet. If you watch a mother penguin carrying her babies around on her feet so their tootsies don't get too cold, but they breed on the land, whether it be cold, warm, or icy, and they have a total bird structure.
Oh, very good. Okay, another quick question here about trilobites. You have one of the largest collection of trilobites that I've ever seen, John. We have a few here, including some of the ones that you excavated from Wales. What about trilobite size? What kind of different sort of variety of trilobites?
The biggest trilobite I've seen is on the bottom of one of the lakes in Canada, which would have been well over a metre in length. Now, the biggest trilobite I personally have is a bit over half a metre, and the smallest trilobites I have a whole sheet of baby trilobites, which would be no more than sort of a child's fingernail in size. And even the baby trilobites have been preserved because they've rolled up. It's an innate characteristic, and the one reason they've been preserved is they rolled up to cover themselves from, sadly, a terror that was coming, e.g. a bed of silt that preserved them, that was washed in before they could get away, because belonging to what you and I call roly-poly groups, they roll up to defend themselves, whether it be from attack or from sand or missiles or mud or burial, and as soon as they think they're safe, they unroll and crawl away. You find them rolled up like that, then you find them really, really in magnificent condition. And that's how we discovered their intestines, because you can cut them open and study inside. So even though they didn't know what they were when they started, now we can actually do magnificent excavation. You want to try one, Craig, I'll send you down a big one, and you can cut him in half and carefully excavate the intestinal stuff, because usually it's pretty well preserved. So that's the size situation. I don't know of any bigger than a metre and a bit one, but they do range in size. I will add one comment about the penguin size. Fossil penguins were up to twice the size of our big penguins today. You know, the emperor penguins, we have fossils found in New Zealand which sort of stand nearly up to my height. Big penguins, and like many creatures, they have diminished in size. And I think it's a good point to make. Diane and I will be talking about gum trees from other countries as well as in Australia. Correct, Diane?
Yes, yes, indeed. And going back to penguins, we have actually written about those giant penguin fossils. So if you go to our fact file and look up penguins or fossil penguins, you'll find something about, and quite a few questions about penguins as well. People like penguins, so we have written about them in both the fact file and on the Ask site.
I actually watched a documentary fairly recently about the emperor penguins in Antarctica and how much they actually hate the cold. And it's a real they survive it, but they quite a number of them don't, and they really battle against the blizzards and the cold weather down there. They don't like it at all.
No, they survive there because nothing else does. And as long as they stay on the coast and can go swimming and fishing, they will survive. But it's really life on the edge.
And there's a lot of evidence.
Question about the emperor penguin is the biggest one now, to my knowledge. Do you agree with that, Diane?
Yeah. Yes, it's the biggest living one, but the fossil ones certainly were bigger.
Yeah. But you've got to remember that there's a lot of evidence, and I'm not talking about the geological fossils, right? Because most of them are flood ones. But there's evidence that Antarctica was not as cold as it was even after Noah's flood. Because if you go, remember Antarctica, the Arctic is just mostly, floating ice, the North Pole, whereas Antarctica is actually landmass. It's continental landmass. And so you can go down, and underneath the ice, you have soil. And you have soil that is good soil and soil that has plant remains in it. And so at some point, you had the penguins arrive, and then at some point the ice came, and the penguins wished they hadn't ever come. They're able to survive because everything else has died out, and they're the only ones that are able to be left there. But it's not like they chose to go there because it was just the right temperature for them.
And if you do go down there, look for the red soil. And the key is, I mean, red soil is from the Antarctic right through to the equator in the southern hemisphere, and it's always indicative of warm, wet climate. So that's what used to be under there before the ice came. So penguins probably came before that.
Yeah, and if you'd have watched the Fire and Ice program that we did in Iceland, we found that red soil up in Iceland as well, right? And so you find it in the cold of Iceland and the cold of Antarctica, in the hot, dry of Australia. At some point, the world was warm and wet and pleasant, and it's gone from good to bad to worse, as we've dealt with many, many times before, including on this program. Well, it's about time that we bring everything to a close.
Yes.
We're coming up to the end of our program here and the time that we have together. But thank you very much for joining us. We'll be back next week. And one other thing just to mention, you will see that sometime probably tomorrow, or if not early next week, there will be a poll that will go out on our YouTube channel. It'll be in the community post, so keep an eye out of it. If you're subscribed, you should get a notification about it if you've rung the bell, or in your subscriptions section of your YouTube channel feed. But there will be a poll which we want to try and get some of your feedback. We're looking to kind of shift some of the timings of creation conversations because it doesn't really hit anywhere in the UK. It kind of works for us as a team, but it doesn't hit prime time anywhere around the world. It's just a little bit too early for Australia, a little bit too late for the UK, and sort of, mid-afternoon work time for the Americans. So we're looking to shift some stuff about. We're going to put some polls out, get some feedback. So we would greatly appreciate it if you would just respond to those feedbacks, to those polls, and give us some feedback rather about the future of creation conversations. But until next week, guys, it's been wonderful to have you here. Thank you for all of your engagement, and we will see you very soon. Goodbye, God bless, and we will catch you next week.
Yes.